Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. On behalf of REALPAC, the Real Property Association of Canada, and CCLI, the Canada Climate Law Initiative, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, where we'll be discussing the new guide on climate governance in the Canadian commercial real estate sector. My name is Darryl Neate, and I am Vice President of ESG at REALPAC. For those of you who may not be familiar with REALPAC, we are the National Leadership Association dedicated to advancing the long-term vitality of Canada's real property sector. Our 125 plus members represent some of the largest real estate companies in Canada across office, retail, industrial, apartment, hotel, and senior residential sectors from coast to coast to coast. I would like to begin our meeting by acknowledging that REALPAC's office in Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, is located on the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, as part of an intricate nationhood that reaches across Turtle Island. So we have an exciting topic and project that we are talking about today. The topic is climate change and governance, and the project is a guide that is the result of a collaboration between REALPAC and CCLI. And it's intended to fill a gap that we saw in the market. And that gap is providing guidance for real estate board members and executives, and also to provide context and to help them take action on climate risks. So I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague Sonia Lee at the Canada Climate Law Initiative and the report's authors Temi and Helen, who will be presenting their research and findings during our webinar. But before I introduce Helen and Temi, Sonia, I wonder if I could ask you to take a few moments to say a few words of introduction.
Thank you, Darryl. Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by saying that I'm joining from the traditional unceded Indigenous land of the Kahnawake Nation, currently known as Montreal. My name is Sonia Lee, and I'm the Director of the Canada Climate Law Initiative. CCLI provides businesses and regulators climate governance guidance so they can make informed decisions as we move towards a net zero economy. We work with boards of directors and trustees to ensure they understand their legal duties with respect to climate. Today, I'm very pleased to be here with REALPAC. REALPAC has been a key partner in this project to ensure our guide helps directors and officers of commercial real estate companies. So thank you again for your support and for hosting this webinar with us. So Darryl, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. So first of all, Temi Onifade is a climate and low carbon law researcher at Canada Climate Law Initiative, where he has contributed to several projects. He is also a permanent lecturer at the University of Bristol Law School. Previously, he was a researcher at Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative, and he has taught at the University of British Columbia and Memorial University and practiced business law across many firms. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Helen Tooze, who also works as a researcher for the Canadian Climate Law Initiative and is currently writing her doctoral thesis at the Peter A. Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. Helen's broad research interests include banking and securities law, corporate governance, structured financial products, mandatory climate change reporting, and financial systemic risk in Canada, the UK, and the European Union. So before I hand it over, I just wanted to say that we're going to, by way of an agenda, we're going to hear for about 15 to 20 minutes from both Helen and Temi as they provide an overview of the findings and the guide. And then we're going to engage in a little bit of a conversation. So at that point, and as you're kind of hearing the presentation, just encourage you to kind of collect any questions you have, and please put them in the chat, and I'll facilitate the conversation from there and kind of bring any questions forward that you may have. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Temi.
Thank you so much, Darryl, and thank you, Sonia Lee. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to give a snapshot of what we have worked on for many, many months, almost a year. Thanks to REALPAC for the support. We've been able to learn a lot about the real estate sector, particularly the commercial real estate sector in Canada through this project. So in terms of the content of the report, there are four major contributions. So we made some contributions on the risks that the real estate sector is facing, and also on the legal duties of directors and executives, and on the effective governance actions that can be taken to address those risks. Then we conclude with opportunities. So I'll be speaking about the risk part, the first part. Then my lovely colleague, Helen, will speak about the legal duties and the effective governance actions. And then I will come back to conclude on the opportunities. So on the risk front, the most important finding, I think, is on the governance of climate risks, and what executives and directors should be paying attention to. The summary, I think, is that we need to pay attention to risks as systemic rather than as financial issues only. Why does this matter? So we know that physical risks are now differential and compounding. In other words, there are certain parts of Canada that are more impacted by physical risks than others. And then there are parts of Canada where risks are manifesting over and over in multiple forms: wildfires, floods, extreme weather events, without giving us any break at all. So that makes it quite challenging to deal with. So far, the main approach or the main mechanism to deal with these risks is insurance, based on the information disclosed by real estate companies. However, we know that insurers are also adjusting their models, and they are trying to make sure that they do not lose money while trying to insure real property, real assets, and real property of companies. So because of these uncertainties, and also because transition risks, risks from changing laws and policies, risks from changing technologies, changing markets, many of these transition risks cannot be predicted. We need to move away from the financial risk management approach, which, like I mentioned, mainly focuses on using insurance, right? And thinking in terms of money, cost and benefit for money. Apparently, we cannot even calculate some of the cost and benefits. Take, for instance, try to calculate the cost and benefits of new policies that will be made in the future. You cannot do that. So we need the systemic risk governance approach, which would help to get more sources of information and has other strengths that we may get into later in the discussion. So on the risk end, I think the main take home for the report, or from the report, is that we should look beyond the financial risk approach, but we should also think of the systemic risk governance approach. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Temi. So as discussed in the guide, we approach the question of current duties and effective climate governance from a regulatory perspective of different organizations. To this end, we worked with REALPAC to discern the structure of their membership to create relative narrative, for those members in light of their regulatory requirements on climate governance. The current duties are presently quite vast, especially for public companies. And my going through them all today would probably put everybody to sleep. So we selected a few key requirements to discuss today. For publicly listed companies, you should all be already aware that you need to continuously disclose climate-related considerations to the AIF and MD&A forms. If you don't, then you better get a move on and read our guide. But for the more fascinating and contested area of climate disclosure requirements arise on the question of forward-looking information. There is a lot of uncertainty that arises with the disclosure of forward-looking information. Instead of being focused on climate-related risks, forward-looking information, or FRIs, focuses on companies' management of those risks through targets and metrics. Many issues have been raised about this requirement. Many companies are worried about disclosing on targets that, although they appear attainable at the time of disclosure, may not be achieved in the timeframe specified, if at all, and whether there would be sanctions due to this. This is a very valid concern. However, the CSA encourages the annual revision of FRIs, which allows for a movement in targets should circumstances change that would make this attempt impossible or difficult, or more difficult than first anticipated. With regards to investors in the real estate sector who are regulated by OSFI, which includes both federally regulated financial institutions and federally regulated pension plans, there's a duty to ensure that climate risks associated with their portfolios are fully considered and that any management of those risks are reflective of the long-term goals and strategies of the portfolio. So it's imperative that portfolio managers who invest heavily in real estate familiarise themselves with the material risks and what real estate companies are currently doing to manage those risks. Sophisticated investors must take the time to ensure that they and their clients are cognizant of what actions are being taken by the companies in which they invest, and then they must be prepared to ensure that that behaviour aligns with the risk appetite frameworks or the SIPs, their statements of investment policies and procedures. And for private companies, although there are minimal legal requirements to disclose, there's a plethora of opportunities to gain from voluntary reporting on climate-related information. Although it can appear burdensome at first, there's an opportunity to get ahead of the curve, especially for a company considering going public in the future. Also, private companies that may move towards partnerships with regulated firms will need to be ready to report. So engaging in voluntary reporting now can ensure your company is ready for those important partnerships in the future. When we looked at investigating effective governance in this guide, we found 6 governance strategies based on existing climate governance literature and guidelines provided by the TCFD, World Economic Forum, and CCLI, as well as accounting guidelines such as the International Financial Reporting Standards and the Accounting Standards for Private Enterprises. Compositely, these strategies are a definitive list, but are meant to provide REALPAC or real estate companies, and investors with a starting point, or if you've already started, it helps you with a map to map where you are in covering necessary bases. So to this end, informative guiding questions are associated with each strategy in the guide to provide a prompt to help you consider where you are in the climate governance process. The 6 strategies we identified are governance structure, board oversight, risk management and assessment, disclosure and risk communication, target setting and metrics, and then strategic design. Governance structure is one of the most important strategies, if not the most important strategy. This is the foundation on which companies for climate governance success is all based. So this strategy, in tandem with the board oversight strategy, focuses on the board of directors and their leadership of companies. Without strong leadership to guide a company in the right direction on climate governance matters, all other strategies will flounder. It's imperative that board of directors are aligned with management and stakeholders on necessary duties, activities, and structures that are required to be a successful company in climate-related matters. The governance structure and oversight speaks to the board's ability to question their role, the company's current progress, and the proactive measures that can be implemented to aid in their improvement. It also requires that boards are effective at communicating their findings to the rest of the company to create a culture of consideration for climate-related risks and opportunities. So this leads us on to the risk assessment and management. The board's examination of the company's present climate governance situation essentially leads on into an in-depth consideration of the risks that are likely to affect that company, the materiality of those risks in terms of disclosure requirements, and how to successfully manage those risks going forward. This includes duty to educate and familiarise oneself with climate-related risks and management opportunities. So once a board has identified those risks and best means of overcoming them, they can successfully get realistic targets and metrics, and make them a reality for the future. The setting of those targets goes hand in hand with the design strategy that we spoke about as well. This is the future of the company in the new landscape that's being created. So the targets and metrics talk of the future goal of the company with regards to mitigating the climate effect, but a clear and concise strategy is needed to achieve those goals whilst remaining relevant in the marketplace and maintaining financial outcomes. And finally, the board, along with other members of the company's management and all key stakeholders, must work together to ensure they appropriately communicate with each other on their risk assessment, management targets and metrics. It's an opportunity for companies to move beyond their own bubble and work together with other companies to ensure that climate governance is successful for the whole group. It's a legal imperative, especially for listed companies, to disclose climate-related risks in their management and the company's forward-looking strategy that we discussed earlier. But in some instances, this requires detailed knowledge of the companies you work with as well, and the investors that are involved in projects. So having that conversation and sharing information with one another, just during the normal course of business, will make the legal requirement to disclose easier, but more importantly, accurate. So thank you for listening, and over to you, Tony.
Thank you, the erudite Helen. So we discussed taking effective governance steps would reveal some opportunities. You know, automatically, when boards and directors do what they should be doing in addressing climate change, they are going to be coming across some of the opportunities that are emerging in the low carbon transition, particularly in the net zero transition. So I will outline some of these opportunities. In the report, we classify them into, I think, 5. One is resource efficiency, 2, incentives, 3, investments, then 4, resilience. Then there are some other opportunities that we group together. So on resource efficiency, you know, imagine just using reduced power, right, to address climate change, or reducing your emissions. You could cut costs doing either of those things. For instance, if you reduce, spend less money, you know, on power, while supporting the net zero agenda, supporting government efforts, and supporting the efforts of other stakeholders. Also, if you cut the amount of carbon you release into the atmosphere, you also benefit from reduced cost of carbon. As many people know, we now have legally binding carbon tax system, you know, run by the federal government. So the higher emissions you make, the more money you're going to have to spend on carbon tax. So that's one way to benefit from acting on climate change and reducing emissions. Resource efficiency is another opportunity. Basically, it's the idea that when you reduce, incentives, that's what I wanted to say, that's the next one. So incentives come from government. Government is now providing money and other resources to support low carbon transition. So if you look at the 2030 plan that was released earlier this year, government has diverted some money into low carbon transition and net zero agenda. And some of that is going into the building sector, into construction, into electricity. So real property companies that position themselves to benefit from these sources would be ahead of the curve. Another opportunity is resilience. So basically, resilience is the idea that businesses should position themselves to survive in the low carbon transition and the net zero pursuit. Companies that do not prepare well are going to lose out. For instance, we know that the younger generation of people, the Gen Zs, people of my generation, the millennials, they all prefer, well, most of them prefer to use green products, you know, green housing, green buildings, green assets. They want to invest in green assets. These are some opportunities that real estate companies could take advantage of. Also, there are some other opportunities that we group in the category of others. So for instance, the more you take action on reducing emissions and keying into the low carbon transition, there will be job creation. There will be better relationship with communities. So think of like relationship with indigenous peoples who have been making the point on reducing emissions and asking governments and companies to try to move away from fossil fuels for a long time. So there will be better relationship with them. Better relationship leads to better social license, you know, acceptability within those communities. Those are some of the major opportunities, and we outline them in the report. So if you have questions, I think there will be opportunities to ask those questions. I think I'll stop here, and over to you, Darryl.
Okay, thanks very much, Helen and Temi. All very interesting points. You covered a lot of ground there. Starting with the comment about systemic risk and financial risk. You talked about the timeline, getting ahead of things. The guiding questions. I found that to be a particularly interesting part of the report in terms of honing right in on, what boards and senior directors and management should be looking at. I wonder if my first question, and just encourage everyone again, if there's any questions, to put them in the chat, and be happy to put those forward. But one question that kind of comes to mind for me is, for organizations that may be new, boards that may be new to climate risk in commercial real estate, I wonder what type of low-hanging fruit that you've seen in terms of actions that corporate directors and officers can take. What have you seen in your research? What have you seen different real estate companies do? Where do people start? I'll leave it to either of you to jump in, whoever wants to jump in first.
Happily jump in first on this. I've been a part of a few discussions.
Sorry, Helen, I'm not sure if your sound might be a little bit off.
Let me try something.
Yeah, Helen, you have that echo.
That echo. Is it better? Or am I still echoing?
Yeah, it's better.
That's better. Thank you.
I apologize for that. I've had the honor of being a part of a number of discussion groups from various industries when it comes to how to implement climate governance and what's the easiest way to get started. And from all the information I've gleaned, I would say, firstly, the most important low-hanging fruit that you can kind of grab hold of is to educate yourself on climate risk and governance. Ask questions about your company and what you know as a company and what you don't know. A very interesting thing somebody once said to me is if you focus on your shareholders and your stakeholders, and ask yourself the question what the environment would say to you as a company if they were your stakeholder. It's an interesting way and a different perspective on how to view your role with your stakeholders in the environment and climate change. But most importantly, I think I would say that, seek help from consultants if you can. You can't know everything all of the time. There are professionals out there that can help, that have focused their lives on this. And I mean, CCLI is one of them. They can offer help through experts. They can come to your board and speak to you, but you don't have to know everything all at once. So getting help and to understand your role and ask the right questions, get educated, I think is the most important low-hanging fruit.
All right,
yeah. Thanks. Very, very helpful. Temi.
Yeah, that's a great point, Helen. And, on the points, for instance, you could get free advice from the CCLI's Climate Governance Experts Program. And there are many resources, coming to this kind of launch. You can ask questions. Of course, it might not be easy to give you tailor-made answers, but with experts here can give you some kind of sense. And some kind of ideas that could help you address whatever issue you want to address. So I think the other point I'm going to add is that you could communicate the exposure of your assets to stakeholders, and the advantage of that is, one, you get to inform those that might be impacted by climate risks and opportunities. Two, if you ever get sued, you have a line of defense in law, right? So most laws usually provide for communication as one of the defenses that you could raise if you get sued on climate change. I think the other point I'm going to make is also to try to provide some kind of qualitative and long-term, medium-term / long-term planning. So qualitative information, provide that, not just quantitative information. and then make plans for the medium and long term rather than just the short term. Those are really important. As you know, if we rely on just quantitative information, there are some risks that do not have enough quantitative information. For instance, how do you quantify the Pan-Canadian framework, or how do you quantify the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act? These are laws that create more costs for you, for your companies. So how do you quantify those? You need to really think about qualitative sources of information.
Thank you. All right. Well, I have to go back to the point about getting sued. I'm sure you've caught people's attention there, and interesting point. So, but let's go there for a moment. Maybe could I ask you to share from your experience, what types of climate litigation cases have you seen in the market more generally, and perhaps any that could be linked to real estate? I'm not sure there's been any in Canada, but maybe there have, or obviously maybe elsewhere. But maybe you could speak to that point a little bit more about climate litigation. Maybe help the attendees kind of understand that a little bit more. What are the risks, from a litigation legal perspective?
Happy to take that one first, Helen, or do you want to go? Okay, so that's an exciting question. So actually, there is a recent case that I used to teach my students in the UK. I'm not aware of cases in Canada, but if you look at the UK, you'd find a case between Friends of the Earth and the Secretary of the State, basically the UK government. And the case is about the expansion of Heathrow Airport. And Friends of the Earth went to court, and some other collaborators went to court for judicial review, challenging the government decision to grant permission for the expansion of the Heathrow Airport. So even though that action wasn't successful, the court clearly said that the secretary in charge of the decision did take into account the Paris Agreement. So it's even taking into account international climate law, not domestic climate law. So even though the Friends of the Earth wasn't successful, what that tells us is that the court is already paying attention to climate law and developments on climate change. And we can expect, cases in the future to be successful. And don't forget that in Canada, we've already had some kind of judicial recognition of climate change and climate impacts, and also the power of the federal government to legislate on climate change. In the case of Saskatchewan, the greenhouse gas pollution pricing reference case that we had a number of years ago, where the Supreme Court recognized the power of the Canadian federal government to make laws for the benefit of the country because climate change is an emergency. So those are the kinds of developments we have to pay attention to. So I expect many more cases to come up. I'm sure there are already some cases in courts, but yeah, we just didn't get the opportunity to look around the world for those cases. Maybe Helen has found any other one.
I can't say that I have. I've done a lot of litigation, climate litigation lists and work, and I haven't seen anything specific to real estate. So I'm
sorry, Helen, you're echoing again.
Sorry.
Apologize.
I'm really glad. Is that better? Sorry. I'm really glad that you have an example, because I do not. I cannot add any more to that question than Temi has already offered.
All right. I thought there'd be some something in the U.S. that might have caught your eye or been out there, but I guess an evolving sport. I'm just looking to the chat. I do see a hand raised. I wonder if we could ask you. I think I see Albert. I wonder if you could type your type of question in, and I'd be happy to raise that for you if you don't mind. And I don't think I see any other questions at the moment.
Darryl, I also can give him the option to talk if you would rather him just unmute.
Sure.
Yeah?
Yep,
Okay,
sure.
Albert, I'll allow you.
Okay.
if you mind just unmuting
Hello.
yourself.
Oh, there you
Yeah,
Right,
the
Albert.
chat's disabled. That's why I don't think you see any questions being
Oh.
punched in, which is why I raised my hand. But I do have a
thank you.
question nonetheless, while you solve the chat disabling. I have a question tied to the problem of data. So we talk about disclosures, and you see regulatory bodies saying, hey, you know, like you should set targets and, you know, measure your performance. You know, so I work in a financial institution, and a big challenge is the reliability and consistency of data in terms of like more like the scope 3 side of things on emissions and climate impact. And so it's difficult, right? You don't want to lead the curve and set a standard within your organization that then someone else says, oh, hey, this is how you should measure and compare yourself to other industry partners. You also don't want to do anything. So I just have a question, like what has your research shown you about climate measurement as it relates to financial institutions? I work in real estate financial institutions, so that's why I'm asking. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. I don't know if Helen, I'm happy to. Helen, do you wanna? You're the financial expert.
It's an excellent question, and I think it speaks to the fact that we're on very new ground at the moment. I think there isn't any clarity. I haven't in my research yet come across any specific ways in which doing, especially like you say, scope 3 data is wrong or it's right. I don't see why there shouldn't be somebody leading the curve. You say you don't want to lead the curve, but why not? Why wouldn't you want to be the leader in that? Even if you get it wrong and at some stage somebody comes along later on and says, well, we've done it this way and it's better, that's okay. It's about the fact that you are leading the way and you're showing and demonstrating that this is our data. It's not perfect, we all know that. Even the CSA has identified the fact that data cannot be perfect. It's a learning place, but if nobody's willing to step forward and lead the curve on these kind of things, then we aren't going to progress.
Yeah, I think the concern is the risk of misrepresentation, right? We misrepresent the impacts that we've had, positive or negative, on the environment, and then we're held to a different standard at a much later time, which opens up legal risks, right? That's like where I've kind of thought that through.
I might just weigh in a little bit there as well. So PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, has some guidance out. I think they are in the process of finalizing a draft for carbon accounting that is tied a little bit more directly to real estate, and that's in partnership with GRESB. So I think that's one reference point that could be helpful. Obviously, the GHG protocol is the core kind of carbon accounting guidance. GRESB is also relevant to the discussion in real estate. I kind of just weigh in on the question saying, I think all you can do is the best you can do with the existing tools and guidance. I think you're right to point out, Albert, that there is some inconsistency around things like scope 3. Those are active discussion points. There are data gaps, data quality issues around that. But I think right now, the best the organizations can do is to follow the leading standards that exist, draw their boundaries around their greenhouse gas inventories, consistent with what makes sense for their organization and the data quality that they have, and just be clear and transparent around any assumptions that they've made and kind of methodologies they're following, because it is very much an evolving exercise. REALPAC is actually facilitating a conversation as we speak around some of these issues in terms of scope 3 and what's in and what's out, and kind of how different organizations can very reasonably report on their emissions depending upon what sector, what asset classes they're involved in, or what part of the real estate value chain they're in as well. So hopefully that's helpful too. Just it is active. It is not perfect. It's imperfect for everyone, and it is partly a function of where we are.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that we should also keep in mind that data gaps are not just about quantitative gaps, right? So we know that we have quantitative gaps on physical risks, but there are even more serious gaps on transition risks, right? How do you measure some of the transition risks that we have, whether on technologies, on market reaction, on laws and policies that are changing with the low carbon transition. And that's part of, we talk quite a bit about data gaps in the report, and that's part of the reasons we emphasize the need to move away from that financial approach to a systemic approach that can help you expand your sources of information. For instance, by engaging stakeholders and then using that engagement as one of the points you refer to in your reports, right? That's still at the early stage, but I think that is going to be the future of dealing with some of these data gaps.
Thank you. And well, that's amazing. If we can just ask people to put up their hand, then I think that's probably more dynamic than the chat. So let's kind of keep that going. That's a good thing, that perhaps a blessing in disguise that the chat didn't work. So anyone else, I just encourage you to put up your hand if you want to ask a question, or if you would prefer to use chat, let's do that as well. I just had a question that kind of came up as well. Temi, you mentioned, or kind of came to mind, you mentioned insurance in your comments, and we're talking about kind of systemic risks. I mean, some people are suggesting that, and kind of pointing to the fact that maybe insurance is going to be no longer sufficient to manage physical risks of climate change. We're seeing it in some instances already, I think, in terms of the most at risk, kind of residential and commercial assets in some parts around the world. I wonder if you could comment on that, and how do you see that? What have you seen in kind of your kind of work, and Helen, I'm not sure if you've kind of looked into this as well, but kind of how can real estate companies think about, how should real estate companies be thinking about systemic risk in terms of physical risk of climate change, kind of going forward? Wonder if you could kind of weigh in on that.
Absolutely. So one of the challenges that we've talked about is that insurance is not adequate, just because at the end of the day, insurance is a business, right? They want to make money, and they are already changing their models and trying to protect themselves. For instance, in the recent floods in Atlantic Canada, I know people who try to get some insurance to protect some of their property, and they were declined. We know that also has happened in other places. So I do think that insurance is extremely limited. And again, that makes it necessary to look at things from the risk governance lens. So unlike the insurance approach, which is basically a financial lens model, the risk governance model helps to think of various ways to incorporate risks into business, so into real estate business models, with the goal of actually preventing the risks that are preventable and then mitigating those that are not preventable. That way, you reduce the exposure to loss of money and loss of property before getting to the level of trying to get insurance. I do not know whether there will be new models of insurance that can project into the future to sort of find a premium price that would be suitable to the kind of risks that they're going to take on. But right now, we do not have that. So to my mind, the best way to deal with this would be to try to prevent those risks and then mitigate those that you cannot prevent by, for instance, engaging stakeholders and then documenting that, saying financial reports or other documents of the company. Yeah, that's about what I can say, because there's just no way to be very confident about insurance at the moment.
No, thank you. It's a very challenging discussion point, and I know for many of our members, as they're looking at the physical risks of climate change, it's the front line and thinking about it, and it's something I think a lot of people are struggling with in terms of what is insurance going to cover today and where is it going in the future. Helen, I wonder, a question for you. Kind of coming back to many large real estate companies in this country are private. You know, many of them are voluntarily, obviously, and have been for many years, reporting on their, you know, their climate performance. But as we move into a new area of, you know, kind of elevating from reporting numbers to talking about, you know, TCFD stuff, financial risks, and you know, kind of strategy and more detailed around climate financial related risks. You know, what are you seeing? Or have you kind of come across any private companies, you know, and how they're working through that? How much they put out in the public realm? You know, what's their legal duty to kind of report on climate related risks broadly? Is it just because they're private companies, they just need to report to their internal stakeholders? I wonder if you could kind of take that whole concept of, you know, climate related risks and reporting, you know, for private companies, private real estate companies.
Yes, for sure. Private companies obviously don't have a firm legal duty to disclose, the same as public companies, and they can find themselves a bit unsure about what they have to do, I think, with regards to disclosing information, whether it is to just their general meeting and their shareholders or further afield. They can voluntarily disclose, and as I discussed earlier, there are numerous benefits to doing so. But I think private companies really do need to keep in mind that they have fiduciary duties as well as directors, which are similar to public listed companies. So even though there's no legal duty to disclose like public companies, their fiduciary duties include the duty of care and loyalty. So the main premise of those duties is that a director should really work in the best interest of the corporation, and they should serve honestly and in good faith and in the interest of the long-term view of that company. And this ties in to climate-related risks and the management thereof. Long-term, we know that there are going to be climate-related risks and problems associated. So considering the long-term view of the company, they must now include that assessment and management of climate-related risks. To not do so would be in breach of their fiduciary duties. And there could be instances, I haven't come across any case law yet, but I can foresee instances where this is possible, where shareholders could start seeking legal help for breach of those fiduciary duties.
Thank you. No, it's interesting. I mean, it's really quite a dynamic across all of ESG, isn't it? Short term versus long term. It's a pressure. It's a tension. It's an ongoing challenge. I guess I'd like to come back to the audience. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. And if not, I have one final question that I'd like to ask you both, and then we'll see if there's any other questions in, or we'll give people a few minutes back in their day. So, you know, you've got a magic wand. You can do one thing to advance the discussion around climate risk and governance. And you know, one or two. You could go two if you really can't get it down to one. But you know, given what you saw in your research, given what you've kind of gone over today, if you could do or kind of have one thing happen, and maybe it's an action governments, or maybe it's an action on companies to progress the climate risk discussion from a governance perspective. So thinking about board members primarily, or kind of senior management within companies, what would it be? Maybe Helen, I'll start with you and come over to you, Helen Tempe. And again, just to be clear for anyone who has questions, please do raise your hand, and if you have something else that you just come up, and we'll unmute you to ask you the question, or allow you to ask your question. But coming back to you, Helen, you got a magic wand. What are you doing?
A magic wand. It really is a magic wand. I think I would. I'd like to remove the fear surrounding climate-related disclosures and the governance. I think a lot of people, like Albert raised, as companies, they have this fear of doing wrong or facing litigation, or something's not right, and it just seems like a very vast task for everybody. I would like, really, I think it would be maybe a simplification of some sort, which would progress that discussion. So if people are not so afraid of what's going to happen if they do disclose really honestly, maybe we would be able to have more of a free flow of thought and discussion. That's people are still to, and some people hear that you can do little steps that start you on your way, and they're so relieved. And so I think that's how I would wave my wand, is just to remove that kind of that fear of talking about it to begin with and disclosing, and just bringing out maybe a less complicated version of things. I think everybody is a little bit overwhelmed by it.
All right, thank you. Temi.
Yeah, sure. Great question. I think for me, it would be that boards of directors, executives should embrace systemic risk governance rather than a financial risk management approach. And if you go to the report, if you check page 27, we actually bring out the advantages or the strengths of using a systemic risk governance approach as opposed to a financial risk management approach using the TCFD model. For instance, the TCFD talks about governance, right? And basically they say that, boards should have oversight. But there are limitations with that. For instance, in that process of oversight, boards tend to rely mostly on technical experts, not the views of stakeholders. Technical experts cannot solve all the problem. For obvious reasons, we don't have enough data. There are no ways they're going to get enough information. So we need information from stakeholders, the feedback from stakeholders, their ideas about solutions to have a better chance of addressing some of those risks. So that's just one example, but there are other examples on that page 27 of the report. So for me, I think it's really important to emphasize the limitations of the financial approach to the governance of climate risks. For instance, using insurance. We should move towards the systemic governance approach, which would help us overcome some of the challenges and limitations of that financial approach.
So Temi, I got to come back on that because I'm not sure I'm clear, and perhaps some others on the call are clear. So most of our members are large real estate organizations driving returns to kind of pay to kind of drive returns for their shareholders, whoever they may be, and obviously financial is core to their business. So I wonder, I'm just kind of trying to tease out. Can you maybe just kind of explain maybe how you see the nuances between the financial approach and the systemic approach again? Can you just kind of give another example of that? I'm not sure it's landing for me yet, anyways.
Absolutely. So let's take specific examples from the TCFD model. So in the TCFD model, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the emphasis is on disclosing, right? Usually the practice is one-way disclosure. The boards of directors, the executives, they would come and say, okay, these are the risks that we are facing, and this is how we're addressing the risks. Now, risk governance, the systemic risk governance approach would say that, well, that is not enough. We need risk communication. So we need two-way flow of information, and that has its advantages, right? One is that you're expanding your sources of knowledge, right? Remember, we talked about those data gaps and gaps on information. You could get more information about the perceived impact of climate change and what your stakeholders actually think should be the solution. The other big advantage that I think a lot of people here would be interested in is that can serve as a sort of defense when there is any form of legal action, right? You could then say, well, we disclosed these risks and we actually got ideas to address these risks. So to be clear, the risk governance model is not saying that companies should not make profit or that companies should not pursue the interests of their shareholders, right? It's only saying that we should think of things in a systems level way, right? Not just from a financial angle. So it's great to make money, but think of the systems impact and system solutions to some of this climate change impacts. I can give other examples if you want.
No, I think that's helpful. No, that's helpful. So they're not mutually exclusive. You're not going to have a different type of thing. You're just building upon it and adding in that more of a stakeholder approach and more of a communications approach to it. Okay, and maybe with one last ask for hands to go up from our audience. And without seeing any, I still see a number of folks on the line. Well, listen, I think I'll just take an opportunity to wrap here then. I think it's been a great conversation. I've certainly taken a lot away from it. We've talked about a number of different things. And so, I think we talked a little bit about the guide, a little bit about climate more broadly. I think the guiding questions in the guide, for boards and management, Helen, you alluded to those. I think those are very important. And encourage folks that have looked at the guide or haven't maybe had a chance to look at it. I think those are really critical from this guide in terms of being practical and hands-on for anyone that's on a board or part of senior executives. So I think that was very helpful to talk about those guiding questions. The low-hanging fruit, I think it was interesting to talk about litigation. We talked a little bit about data and frameworks, talked about different ways to look at risk and insurance. So lots of interesting things, and I see Albert is slipping in here under the radar here. So
sorry, the guide, where can we find it?
The guide is posted, I believe, on the Canada Climate Law Initiative website, and I believe there would be a link through REALPAC as well. I don't have that right in on the top of off the top of my head, Albert, but it's a very good question. What we can do, oh, there we go. Melissa has it. She just put in the link. Thank you, Melissa. I appreciate that. There's the link. It's on CCLI. I think we have a link to it in our website as well at REALPAC. Does everyone see that? Did everyone see that come through in the chat? I think. Maybe Albert, I'll ask you.
Well.
Yeah, I'm the only one unmuted. I don't see anything in the chat. I'm sorry.
You don't see anything in the chat. Okay, that chat is still circulating. All right. We will make a commitment to circulate that to all of you that have attended. So you have that. Alternatively, I imagine a quick Google could find it as well from CCLI and REALPAC Climate Governance. But yeah, thank you. Listen, great conversation, covered a lot of ground. I just summarized some of them. Hopefully you take something away from it. It is a significant piece of research. Again, I'd like to thank the partnership we had, REALPAC, with the Canada Climate Law Initiative and the report authors, Helen and Temi, for some great work. And thank you both for taking some time today as well to share your findings and your research with the audience. So that will conclude then our webinar. Thank you very much for spending some time, and I hope you do can track that down. We'll send it around again, like I said, for further reference. But thank you for joining us today, and all the very best. So we'll be in touch again soon, I'm sure, on this topic. There'll be more to come from both of our organizations, and certainly a very active, evolving discussion as well. So thank you, and have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Darryl.
Thank you. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Helen. Bye-bye.